So we're going to get started now, I think. My name is Randy Collins. I'm a landscape architect with Beta Group. We're working with the town on developing a master plan for downtown improvements. We're working with Gene and Andrew and John. They're from the town. We have a couple people from my group here as well. I have another Andrew and then Jeff. Basically what we're going to do is go through a brief presentation. The presentation that we're going to give is really sort of our introduction to how we look at the downtown. And then the real purpose of tonight's meeting is to be able to get input from you on a number of different things. So the slides that I'm going to show in the presentation, that's going to be relatively brief, is sort of how we look at the downtown, the things that we see, the things that we focus on. I'm going to probably talk a little bit about the kinds of things we'd be interested in hearing back from you. But basically what we're looking to do is get a very good understanding of the downtown from everybody here tonight, so that we can then go and come up with some options for what the downtown could be as far as improvements go, streetscape improvements, pedestrian, traffic, business improvements. And so we want to hear from you on those kinds of things as well. And actually, right before we are going to end the presentation and go to a couple of breakout tables, there's going to be a list of questions that would be great for you to cover at the tables. If you have a question about anything during the course of my presentation, feel free, raise your hand. It's not like I need to get the presentation out of the way, but if you want to have a question for clarification, by all means do so. So with that, we'll get started. The project intent, as I said, is to come up with improvement schemes and a master plan for improvements to the downtown. A lot of that comes out of the community master plan, which you just recently completed. And within that master plan, there's a number of elements that focus primarily on the downtown. So those strategies include enhancing visitation to the downtown through special events, activities, invest in infrastructure and streetscape enhancements for a pedestrian-friendly downtown. These, again, are right out of the master plan. Invest in infrastructure and streetscaping, extend high-visibility crosswalks to additional intersections and provide mid-block crossings. Evaluate the possibility of changing on-street parking to increase sidewalk widths and traffic, and also to possibly make the streets more friendly for biking. Look for opportunities to construct curb bump outs. Hire a consultant to evaluate and recommend the downtown. You guys can check that off the box. You've got it done. We're here tonight to help you out. Continue to plan for and implement the undergrounding of utilities. I'm sure you're all generally aware of that. Evaluate changing zoning to vary storefront setbacks to provide additional space at the back of sidewalks to look for pedestrian gathering areas, green spaces, and wider sidewalks. Use streetscape elements, lighting, benches, street trees, textures to the sidewalk treatments to create a more unified streetscape treatment to connect downtown to the Mill District and add wayfinding to that, wayfinding signage. Repair sidewalks, existing brick sidewalks. Review pedestrian ramps and building entrances for universal accessibility. That's kind of a challenge because if you have like 3 stairs that go, or 2 stairs that go from the back of sidewalk into a business, modifying the sidewalk to make up basically a foot is a challenge, but when it's close is to look for opportunities where we can make buildings more accessible than they might be today. Provide recycling bins and trash receptacles in the downtown. So that's a quick overview of a general set of strategies that came out of the master plan. There's more to it than that. We really want to think about what would make this a vibrant and exciting downtown that would encourage both residents and visitors to want to go to the downtown. That's really one of the main goals and intents of this project. So with that, we've gone through and created what we're calling an existing conditions document, and that touches on a number of different things, looking at zoning, looking at public transportation, bus routes, looking at sidewalks, sidewalk materials, crosswalk locations, looking at parking, understanding how parking is used, crash data, both for vehicles and pedestrians, looking at level of service, how the roadways and intersections operate. And I'm going to touch on some of these in a minute. Turning movement volumes for both cars and bikes and pedestrians. And then looking at street trees and how well street trees, and we sort of stretched it a little bit because there really aren't a lot of street trees out there, so any trees that are within, say, a few feet of the back of sidewalk, we did an evaluation of the quality of those trees. So, but tonight, what we want to do is get through the presentation and on to the part where we break out and get input from all of you. That's, you're going to see as I go through the next few slides, sort of the kinds of things that we look at that in some respects are very technical in nature, but we really need to get an understanding, want to get an understanding of how you view the downtown and how it could be improved. So this is a general overview, same map as the one that was in there on my left as you walked in. We do look at zoning. The gray that you see is general business. You can see a lot of sort of an orangey color, which is residential, that's surrounding that. The project area also touches upon some other industrial types of zones and some nondescript zones as well. And then bus routes. There are 2 bus routes within our study area, and there are a few bus stops, a couple of stop here and a stop here and there. And so that's something that we want to make sure that we consider. And it's also an opportunity. How can we get more people to try to visit the downtown if we made those a little more exciting, a little more accessible for users to get to the downtown and to get out back to where they came from as well, is an important aspect of things that we want to consider. Looking at sidewalks. So this looks at the material of the sidewalk, looks at crosswalk locations, and looks at where bump outs are. So you get a handle on the next step of this would be looking at evaluating the quality of the sidewalks, where there's some issues with heaving bricks or cracks or those types of things. So we want to make sure we have a good understanding of that as well. Parking, typically a very important aspect of something that we look at in the downtown, understanding where parking is, the nature of that parking. So we've evaluated or mapped the different parking limits that are in the downtown, where there's no parking, so that when we start talking about streetscape enhancements, we want to make sure we find a way to balance whatever we're proposing that might include widening sidewalks with maintaining a relatively equal number of parking spaces that are distributed through the downtown. It also gives us a snapshot of how the downtown is being used today, especially when we then look at occupancy and we start to understand how many spaces you have, the nature of the spaces, meaning the time limit that they have, and then looking at how they're being used. This is just a snapshot. So this is a survey that was conducted on Thursday, October 3rd, and we looked at the parking usage at 3 times during the day, 9, 12, and 4, to get an idea of how the parking is being used. And so this would be an example of some really interesting information. You can see the 106% utilization on the parking at 9 a.m. in the western limit of the downtown. Having walked the downtown a number of times, I know what that is, or I assume that's Heavenly Donuts and people stopping and going in and get coffee. But getting an idea of other aspects of how parking is used and where people go, where you tend to find parking issues, where you can't find parking, and where parking is always available, those are important things for us to understand as well. And this is looking at accident data, crash data. This is for vehicles, looking at data at intersections and looking at along the corridors themselves. And this starts to give us insight to where we might find problems with geometry of the roadway, where there may be cars traveling at a high rate of speed, where turning movements are not clearly defined, and so it makes it confusing for the motorist to make those movements. And so this is an important part of the information that we've looked at so far. And then this is level of service, a lot of data, a lot of information. It's basically a report card of how the intersections operate. So you'll see, we look at it in the morning, heavy use time in the morning, heavy use time in the afternoon, and it's an A to an F rating. And so it's not really how good your downtown is. It has a lot to do with the way it's used and whether, as I said just a minute ago about crash information, how well people understand how to make the turns, and if there's really a lot of volume coming out of one road into another road that doesn't have a lot of volume, you might end up backing up that road that doesn't have a lot of volume because it's got a stop condition and it's got to wait for a lot of traffic to clear. So that gives us a bit of a snapshot of how people are driving in the downtown and where they might be coming from and where they might be going. I thought it was important to include, we also look at bike and pedestrian turning movements. We have this as well for traffic. It's not nearly as interesting for the bike and peds. Part of it is just another way to look at the volumes that are going. But one of the things I like to look at is how, when you have a downtown that's surrounded generally by neighborhoods, is how people might be getting there besides from the car. Are they walking, are they biking? And so this was, again, done in the morning peak time and then in the afternoon peak time in the downtown area, the core downtown, and then over by the mills as well, so that we can get a sense of how people are, if people are using bikes, how often, and we, as a time frame in October, this data though is from Avalon, and I forget off the top of my head when that came from, but it gives us a sense of whether or not the people are using bikes as a way of getting to your downtown. And then following that through, to what level we may want to accommodate them and encourage them to do more of that under a new condition, a proposed condition. Other things that we look at when we start looking at streetscape, we're looking at parking and pedestrian accommodations, is what the street widths are. So are there opportunities to, without really having major impacts to where parking currently exists, to look at widening sidewalks to improve areas for pedestrians without having, as I just said, a significant impact on parking, on-street parking. And we're also looking at curb cuts. How wide is a curb cut opening? Because that's where a pedestrian, when they're in the sidewalk area, feels the least comfortable, is when they're being exposed to where cars are coming in and out of, say, businesses that are adjacent to the streets. And so there's guidelines, engineering guidelines on, accommodating vehicles and pedestrians. So we would be looking for overly wide curb cuts and looking at how that we could make some improvements in that by narrowing them down without impacting access to the different businesses and streets that are along the way. So there's just a number of these. And basically what we're finding in a lot of places, and this would be an important part of Main Street sort of coming down the hill into downtown, the roadway is relatively wide open. It's a pretty wide roadway. There's not a lot of parked cars on a regular basis here. So the combination of sort of the downhill incline and wider road, the land uses, meaning buildings and such, are sort of set back from the back of the sidewalk, unlike the downtown where they're closer to the back of the sidewalk, creates a wide open feeling where people tend to feel a little more comfortable riding at a higher rate of speed. And so one of the things that we look at is, well, are there opportunities to narrow this down? Or would we plant a lot more street trees to try to create a vertical edge that tends to give a little friction visually, so it tends to slow people down? So these are all important things that we've been looking at as well. And then we start to look at where there might be opportunities for making some changes to the sidewalk character. This is sort of an interesting place because of the way it's currently configured, is whether or not we have opportunities to make some changes to the curb line to be able to make it a little bit more of a conventional intersection, and also look for opportunities to maybe make little pocket parks or pedestrian enhancements in these wider areas. At all times balancing accessibility into these properties, understanding that there's a reason why this is shaped the way it is currently. And typically something like that is, you find that that's evolved in that way, that maybe that was a wider intersection at one point that may not have ever been there. Then this was put in to give definition. I'm not saying that's the case, but oftentimes when you see a funky little piece of curb line like that, it's something that's evolved over time. And then looking at currently where sidewalks are wide, the green dots are where we actually were looking at trees and did an evaluation of the tree condition. So we get a sense if we want to try to save those trees or not save those. So here's, again, this is by the church. There's a church. You got another interesting little intersection here. If I had the curb cut one up here, this would be a really wide curb cut. Are there opportunities? This is really looking at it from the standpoint of, are there opportunities to make some changes, modest as they might be, to the way the curb cuts and the curb alignments work to try to make the intersections work better for both the pedestrian and the vehicle? So I was going to turn this over to Jeff. but I don't know where he is right now. Oh, there he is. You were behind the pole. So we're going to go into some breakout sessions now. I think generally maybe we'd go in for about 30, 35 minutes or so. It could be longer if there's a lot of conversation. And there's a series of questions that we'd like to have you respond to, as well as anything else that you think is important for us to know. On the tables are a number of plans and some photo boards that show some images of the downtown. What we'd like to do is have you break up into, say, 4 groups. We'll go over there and we'll probably assign you. If it looks like everybody's going to the same table, we'll start saying, we need you to go over here. But we'd like to try to address these questions. We'd also like somebody to volunteer to be the person who's going to report the points that the group thought were important to convey to the rest of the audience. So after all that's done, we're going to come back here. That person is going to talk about the points from that particular group. Don't worry if the group decides that they don't want to have any of you do it. One of us will volunteer to do it. But it's always good to get somebody from the group to talk about that. And I think we'll have a very brief conversation after each one of the groups has had a chance to give a report about some of the findings and make sure there isn't anything that we've missed. And then we would go away and do our next bit of work. So with that, are there any questions? I can get talking and steamroll, so please feel free to just interrupt if I tend to start. Sir?
You didn't mention anything about utilities on Main Street, the power poles. Is that part of
did,
the
actually.
plan? Oh, did you? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I just mentioned that was one of the intents out of the master plan. So, looking at this project would be looking at that as well. And so one of the things that are always a little dicey in working at other communities where they've been looking at undergrounding utilities is how the timing syncs up with your project. So, as we move along, the intent is to make sure that anything that we propose would either accommodate that or be part of that project. Hard to predict at this moment whether having it happen at the same time would work, but we would certainly want to be accommodating that.
Do you have any information for what's been done in the past and maybe what the obstacles were? Because I remember listening to this with the underground utilities maybe 10, 15 years ago.
Over at Town Center? Or, yeah.
When they put in the brick sidewalks.
Yep.
And they said, well, since we're going to rip up all the sidewalks, why don't we bury the utilities? That was the end of that. It was like, do you know why? And
Why they wanted to bury them?
no, why didn't it happen?
Usually why it didn't happen is funding and being able to have the money to do it at the time that project's going forward.
You don't know.
I don't know on that project why, even though I did work on that project a long, long time ago. I think it was Girton Associates that did the town center with the roundabouts that were put in there. Yeah, it was a little more than 15 years ago, but you make it sound better for me. Yeah, no, it's probably right around there. I don't know. I can't answer that question. I don't know.
Because that type of information would be useful if you want to revisit that, find out what happened the last time that it didn't happen.
I would suspect that they had funding secured to do the construction project for the sidewalks. And the idea of doing the utility poles may have been a little bit after that. And so the way that the funding was secured to get the undergrounding done was just not syncing up with that project, I suspect.
From what I remember, that was one of the driving stimulus to redo the sidewalks and as far as the beautification project downtown was to bury it, so it had more of a look like downtown Andover had.
Right.
Where you didn't have all of this the utilities there. So, and what I kind of remember is the problem was Mass Electric owns the poles, right? And the utility companies themselves, and they drag their feet, and I'm sure that has to do with funding and money and budget, but in any case, we went ahead and did the whole project, put in the beautiful brick sidewalks, and the original reason to have done it never happened.
Right.
So I'm just saying, if we're going to go down this road again, why don't we get that done first?
I think the point of this gentleman bringing that up is to make sure that we're aware of that, and we are, because I've worked on other projects where the undergrounding of utilities wasn't syncing up with the construction project, and so we put accommodations underground, putting in conduit, so that it was basically a pre-prepared package for the utility companies to pull the wires through. So if that were the case on this project, that would be one of the things that we would consider.
Because we also went through this at the old center, in the common, that we went through the whole project, and the last thing that got done was ripping up the new sidewalks and taking out the poles. That was done last, when it, in my estimation, should have been done first.
Undergrounding utilities is a big ticket item as far as costs go. So I believe right now, John, correct me if I'm wrong, they're accumulating the money for the undergrounding, and then when they get the money to be able to do that, then they'll do that. So we're, as part of our effort, meeting's over.